Welcome back. We're continuing through our discussion of the proposed White Earth Constitution, and we're going to move on to theme 4, which deals with the chapter 11, which starts on page 23 of your workbook. Excuse me. Chapter 11 is the President. The next 3 sections that we're going to go through deal with each branch of the government. We already mentioned that Chapter 10 sets out a separation of powers, and that this Constitution provides for an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. So the President is under the executive branch, which is Chapter 11. That starts on the bottom of page 23 of your workbook. And we see here the role that the President has under this proposed Constitution. Article 1 tells us that the President, which is the primary term that we use here, or White Earth Chief, that could also be a term used, shall be the official national and international elected representative of the White Earth Nation. And so that sets the President in many ways as the head, the face of the nation, the official leadership of the White Earth Nation, so that there's no confusion about that. Then we get into some of the roles and duties of the President, what the President has responsibility for. Article 2 tells us that the President has the authority to secure and accept grants, negotiate agreements with all kinds of organizations, foundations, organizations, but state, federal, and local governments as well. So the President has that authority to negotiate those agreements. But then we see that the Legislative Council has to ratify them. So we've mentioned the separation of powers, but here we also see the idea of checks and balances amongst those different branches. So as we said, there's 3 branches and they don't have power over each other except for these provisions, like this one that we'll point out as we go through, where there has to be an agreement or there has to be a check and balance between the different branches. So here it is. Our first example, the President negotiates the agreement, the Legislative Council ratifies, checking and balancing on the powers of those 2 branches. Article 3 tells us that the President is responsible for the administration and management of the government and implements and executes the laws, ordinances, resolutions, and other enactment that the Legislative Council makes. We'll talk in the Legislative Council in a little bit more detail in a minute, but they're the law-making body. Essentially, the President is essentially the implementation, executive, executing authority in this case. So it's the President's responsibility to implement and execute. The President also, we see in these next set of articles, deals with the laws and ordinances that the Legislative Council passes. The President can, in Article 4, approve those resolutions, or in Article 5, the President also has the power to veto. If the President decides to veto, Article 6 tells us that the President has 5 days to return those rejected laws or ordinances back to the Legislative Council. And that has to have a statement of objection. So the Legislative Council, if the President vetoes, the President has to give a reason why he or she is vetoing that law. And that's for citizen information, but it's also for the information of the Legislative Council, because we see in Article 7 that the Legislative Council can override a veto of the President. So the Legislative Council, when they get a vetoed provision back, they basically have 2 options. They can say, that's great, Mr. President, you vetoed this law for this reason, but we have a 2/3 majority. We're going to keep this law as it is and override. Or maybe the Legislative Council will take the information about why the measure was vetoed, potentially make some adjustments to that law, and try again to send it to the President.
Right. And the other aspect of that is that's going to happen in the normal process of the legislative process, right? The Legislative Council will be considering a particular law or a bill. The President will give his opinion or her opinion about that law, and that'll move the Legislative Council in their consideration process, or it won't.
Right.
You know, it's
Yeah.
it's still the authority of the legislative council to act as legislators, and it's the responsibility of the president to execute those laws that are passed by the legislative council.
Right, even if the president vetoes a law, if it gets overridden, the president has a responsibility to implement and execute that law.
Right.
And so we have this dynamic of interaction, check and balance in some ways, and hopefully negotiation between the different branches to work out and come to
Exactly.
good decisions for the people. Article 8 tells us that the president has the authority to appoint executive branch administrators and other officials. The president, Article 9, schedules and presides over the legislative council. That's a little bit unique, but does have some parallel comparisons with the vice president in the United States system presiding over. So we see that. Article 10 tells us that the president shall not vote except if there's a tie. So the legislative council, if they're coming to a vote on a measure and it does come to a tie, then the president does have the authority to break that tie with a vote. That is the only time under this constitution that the president votes. And that is similar to the current system. So some
Right.
people are familiar with that, to the way the current chair position works here at White, or voting in the case of a tie. That is similar. Article 11 tells us that the president will deliver an annual address dedicated to the state of the nation. Again, we're familiar with that. That's something that's already going on under the chairperson's role. Article 12, the president has to be bonded. Article 13 is an important provision related to term limits. All of the elected officials, the president, the legislative council, have term limits. The only exception to that is the chief judge, which we'll talk about when we get to the judiciary. But this restates here the provision that was already stated in Chapter 6 that relates to term limits. The president can serve no more than 2 4-year elected terms.
Right. So
And-
not too consecutive. It's a very kind of clear and clean term limit of 2 4-year terms, period.
Exactly. Yes, we get some questions about that. The
Right.
question is if a person would serve 2 4-year terms and then say leave and get a job somewhere else and then could they come back and run again? The answer to that is no. That person has already served 2 terms.
Right.
Therefore, they would be ineligible. They would be eligible to run for a seat on legislative council or for secretary treasurer. So that term limit works by seat of office, essentially. So somebody could serve 2 terms as president, 2 terms as secretary treasurer, and 2 terms as a representative on the legislative council. If they were that would be the most anyone could ever serve if they were to be elected to all of those different positions over time.
So one of the kind of distinctions about this executive office under the proposed constitution and the current MCT process is similarities in the sense of the president having a role of calling meetings and
Right.
a vote in case of a tie, but very distinct in other ways. Right? How would you describe the authority that the president has to execute, to implement laws as compared to the legislative authority of the legislative council? Do you know what I mean? What distinctly is it about the president's authority to execute laws and implement laws and manage the government? How would you describe that?
How is that different than the the legislative council creates the law,
Exactly.
and then the president is responsible for the day-to-day, in a lot of ways, it's more the day-to-day implementation process. What does that mean? How does a law that says things like the Constitution, sometimes the laws aren't that specific. We have to figure out what does that mean on a day-to-day basis. And so the president in the implementation process figures that out and maybe creates the process for that implementation.
Right. And also, just the day-to-day management of government functions from that executive perspective. Right now, the legislative council is, in some ways, all legislators are councils, tribal councils that are organized under this style of constitution, right? The MCT Constitution is a style of constitution that's similar to Pine Ridge, a number of other. It was a model constitution that was put forward under the Indian Reorganization Act in the 1930s. And you got to remember the policy of the federal government in that time was really a forced assimilation. It wasn't one of self-determination. The kind of ethics and principles of the time were profoundly racist. You know, it just wasn't the same America that we see today. And those policies are reflected in the kind of intent and purpose of assimilation of the model constitution that was put forward by the Indian Reorganization Act in the 1930s that a lot of tribes adopted. And that's what you see in the MCT Constitution. That's what you see in my constitution at Pine Ridge, where I'm from. And that's part of what is attempting to be distinguished here. That there's a distinction between the authority of the president in its function of implementing those laws and managing the government, right? And a distinction, we'll go over the Legislative Council, exactly what authorities they have. And so that's a part of what is at stake here as far as your consideration. Separate branches of government, a separation of powers clause, an independent judiciary, and what that means. And whether you think that would work here. Is that a better system? It's a part of your consideration. We're not saying it's right or wrong or better or not. But we are saying that a number of tribes across the country recognize that the model constitution put forward by the Indian Reorganization Act just don't work for us. And they cause a lot of problems. That's a part of the consideration here in just realizing, accepting the fact of how the model constitution of the IRA is faulty and problematic.
It has a focus on business and the official name Reservation Business Committees, even though White Earth here and others have sort of informally changed it to Reservation Tribal Council. That language in the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe Constitution is Reservation Business Committee. And so we can see just in the difference of language there and terminology, the role and the scope of government, the idea of a business committee and what authority and powers they have versus a system where we're talking about a legislative council that's a law-making body versus the idea that's simply focused on business. So some distinct differences amongst those. And then I think we just have Article 14, which is just a sort of ethical. The president shall promote, protect, and defend the cultural and political sovereignty and the Constitution of the White Earth Nation. And the final article, Article 15, which is that the president shall have the authority to nominate honorary ambassadors, consuls, citizens, to initiate and establish embassies of the White Earth Nation to serve national and international concerns. We have had a few jokes on this. Many people have volunteered to be the official ambassador to France or perhaps a tropical area in the Caribbean or something of that nature. That seems relatively unlikely that the Legislative Council would appropriate funding for an ambassador to that area. What's more likely here is the president nominating an honorary ambassador to serve at different functions. There are lots of functions where the president does a formal ribbon cutting, a sort of that type of thing, where the president, in this case, may nominate an honorary person to serve in that capacity. Embassies, we currently refer to the White Earth Urban Office in Minneapolis. Some people refer to that as an embassy, so it's just a terminology, language difference there, but there may be the establishment of offices of that nature.
It also speaks to, very real recognition of the need for any tribal government, any Native American, Indian sovereign entity to have lobbying efforts, education efforts, information efforts, networking, and staff in maybe in DC, where is the kind of central power of the U.S. government, recognizing also that the state of Minnesota is an important partner in a variety of ways. A recognition also that other tribes and relationships with other tribes, right? the reality that there's a very real interconnection between Anishinaabe communities in
Yeah.
Minnesota and in Anishinaabe country as a whole.
At large, yeah.
Wisconsin, Michigan, Canada, all the way across North Dakota into Montana. And so there's a broad base of Anishinaabe people that are part of a historically unified entity. And even though in modern day it hasn't really evolved and developed into a formal political structure.
Not a single government.
Exactly, but that's, that's out there.
Different
And-
associations.
Exactly.
Partnerships.
And the way this Constitution can be supportive of that and incorporating that, and considerations that you have of whether White Earth approving this Constitution kind of supports that and can engage it, or pushes it in the opposite direction, right? Because you have the tribe as a distinct entity organizing more formally as White Earth. And does that support the idea of working to build a broader Anishinaabe or Minnesota-based Chippewa tribe coalition or governing structure? Or does it push it in the opposite direction where it's more divide and, the U.S. strategy of divide and conquer? That's a part of the conversation that's going on here, and it's a part of what this part of the Constitution speaks to as well, I think.
Great. Well, that wraps up the section on Chapter 11, the President. We'll continue on in just a moment with the next section on the Legislative Council. Welcome back.
The next section that we are going to cover is the legislative branch of government. In the previous section, Jill went over the executive branch of government with the office of the President. In this section, we're going to look at the Legislative Council and the legislative branch of government. And you saw in the previous section the kind of authority and responsibility of the President to negotiate agreements, to serve as a spokesperson, and to execute and implement the laws that are passed by the Legislative Council and manage the government from that perspective. Here we're going to look at the Legislative Council. And the first, few articles in this is going to do a similar thing, is really define what the authority and responsibility of the Legislative Council is. In Article 1, it says representatives, again, this is on page 25, it's Chapter 12, Article 1. Representatives of the Legislative Council shall propose and enact laws, codes, ordinances, resolutions, and statutes of the White Earth Nation. So just right at the very beginning, really establishing the primary responsibility of the Legislative Council, of the legislature, to pass laws. Article 2 says the Legislative Council shall have the authority to raise general revenue, levy and collect taxes, establishes licenses and fees, and initiate other levies and taxes for the welfare of the citizens of the White Earth Nation. So defining the second primary function, right? Number 1, to pass laws, to legislate. Number 2, to raise revenues. And then number 3 on Article 3, it says initially Legislative Council shall have the authority to borrow money, issue public bonds, etc., and to initiate other monetary policies in the interest of the White Earth Nation. So, right? So you have 3 distinct purposes. 1, to pass laws. And those laws are going to be whatever the needs of the people are, right? This Constitution requires specific laws to be passed. An election code has got to be passed, right? And there's others as well, right? The process for applying for membership or citizenship, right? So a number of specific codes. And then once you get beyond that, there's going to be, how do you protect and preserve the natural resources? How do you deal with other issues of health and welfare and other things? So a range, public safety, criminal, civil codes, etc. A number of different ways that the Legislative Council needs to act in order to pass laws or legislate and define how those functions are going to operate. And so that's in Article 1. Article 2 talks about raising revenues. That process of raising revenues and paying for those functions, right?
Yeah.
That's the responsibility of the Legislative Council.
There's government programs and need funding.
Exactly,
And so
exactly.
they will raise revenue and then appropriate the funds
Right.
as well. What will be spent on what?
And then Article 3 to initiate other monetary policies, and essentially to establish an appropriations. And what that means is to set the budget, right? So you have, with monetary policies, right? So those first three articles establish the three primary functions of the legislative council, the legislative branch. To enact laws, to raise revenues, and establish a budget, appropriate those funds, so that those funds go to those programs that they're setting up. The president then, the office of the president, the executive office, gets that
Right.
and must act on it. Gets the laws that are passed by the legislative council as defined by the legislative council. The legislative council defines that.
Besides, yep.
And then that's what the president has an obligation to do. The legislative council appropriates the money, sets the budget. And that's what the president is supposed to use in order to implement those laws.
Right.
The legislative council raises funds in order to pay for that. That's what the president does in order to collect those funds and raise and initiate or execute those,
Yeah.
those requirements. So that, in the most simple and straightforward way, is the distinction between the legislative council and office of the president, how they work together and engage together, and how it plays out. Yeah. Article 4 on Chapter 12, establishes a good and powerful, in some ways, obligation on the legislative council to promote and protect the health, welfare, safety, education of White Earth members. Article 5 says that the legislative council can establish subordinate bodies that they need in order to carry out their responsibilities. Article 6 is legislative council is responsible for the proper management of governmental programs. And here it's important to realize that under the separation of powers function describes it as the legislative aspect of managing government programs, right? And that is distinct from the executive responsibility to manage programs, to manage the government. And that is the executive function. So that's how you distinguish the responsibilities and obligations in each of those two chapters.
Right, so in this case, managing for the legislative council is really making that body of law
Exactly.
and appropriating funds.
Exactly.
That's their role in management.
Right. Article 7 deals with the distribution and sale of alcoholic beverages under the authority of the Legislative Council. Article 8's interesting. It says that the Legislative Council cannot establish any covert political, military, intelligence operations without due process of laws against peaceable citizens of the White Earth Nation. Article 9 is also interesting. It establishes residual powers, the powers of governance that are not specifically detailed in the Constitution shall not be construed as the limitation of legislative power or authority. However, the power of government not specifically expressed are entrusted to the Legislative Council shall be reserved to the citizens of the White Earth Nation. So it's an interesting kind of combination of saying that the Legislative Council has a set number of authority, some flexibility in defining exactly what that is. But if it's not specifically expressed or entrusted to the Legislative Council, it's reserved to the citizens of the White Earth Nation. And it's an important part of the consideration of the nature of where the authority really lies and the responsibility of the citizenry and members of the White Earth Nation in that regard. Let's move over to Chapter 13 on page 26. It establishes the authority of the Secretary-Treasurer. And in Article 4, it says that the Secretary-Treasurer shall be a voting member of the Legislative Council. Yeah. So a very clear part of the Legislative Council with the authority to vote there. But in articles, the first articles before that, 1, 2, and 3, it really lays out the role of the Secretary-Treasurer. So in Article 1, it says that Secretary-Treasurer shall be bonded and responsible for monetary and financial matters, resources, documents, and records. Government records shall be available for public inspection and review. So a very distinct obligation placed on the Secretary-Treasurer to manage and take care of those records and make them available for public inspection and review. Article 2, Secretary-Treasurer shall schedule an annual audit of funds and monetary transactions, etc., by a duly certified independent auditor. So an annual audit by an independent auditor to be conducted every year under the authority of the Secretary-Treasurer. Article 3 says Secretary-Treasurer shall carry through official duties and responsibilities of the President and representatives of the Legislative Council. In some ways, the language is kind of difficult to comprehend, but I think it's important in the sense that this function of really making sure the Secretary-Treasurer has access to all those data and information, does an annual audit that accesses all that information accurately and freely. Article 3 says the Secretary-Treasurer uses the authority of the President and the Legislative Council to access all that data. So they're obligated, those two branches, to provide that information, to work cooperatively with them. That is a part of their function, kind of conjoined.
They have to,
exactly.
again, checks and balances in some way.
Exactly.
There.
So that is, and then in Article 5, the Secretary-Treasurer shall provide and publish an annual fiscal report and accounting of the White Earth Nation. So an interesting role that's an enhancement of what you see in the MCT Constitution. And whereas the MCT Constitution requires the Secretary-Treasurer to conduct similar responsibilities, this kind of takes it another step beyond in a way by making sure that each of the branches of government are responsible and obligated to provide that information to the Secretary-Treasurer, so that the Secretary-Treasurer under this Constitution has that authority to accomplish those tasks, and then detailing that records shall be available for inspection and review. So that kind of transparency and capacity in that regard.
And that annual report that has to be published as well. Again, transparency for citizens, or providing citizens information that they need about the government, the annual fiscal report. Again, what money has come in under various revenues or different programs, and how has it been expended, so that they have the authority to have the right to that information.
Exactly.
As they're thinking about electing or re-electing legislative council members or secretary or president, that information is valuable for them to have as part of their consideration.
In some ways it's a unique position in that it's a formal part of the legislative council as a voting member, but with unique responsibilities and authorities to make sure that all the financial data is clearly organized, accessed, collected, included in a formal audit annually, as well as a formal report annually, and made available to the public for their inspection and review. In some ways, a uniquely specific and uniquely powerful position under this Constitution. Okay. So next, we're going to finish out the review of the Legislative Council by going to page 28, and we're going to look at Chapter 17. And essentially, this is the bylaws of the Legislative Council. It talks about how often they meet, how their meetings are going to be run, etc. Article 1 says the Legislative Council shall meet once each month to conduct government business, time and place of each session, posting in advance. Article 2 says citizens of the White Earth Nation have the right to attend sessions of the Legislative Council. Article 3, the President has the authority to schedule special and emergency sessions of the Legislative Council. Article 4, the Legislative Council by a majority vote and written request shall also have the authority to schedule special sessions. Article 5 says that the President shall be obligated to schedule a special session of the Legislative Council by an official petition of 30% of eligible citizen voters in the White Earth Nation. And that's consistent with the referendum process that you saw earlier. And that 3, 4, and 5 talks about those special and emergency sessions, how the President can call one, the Legislative Council can call one, and citizens can call them.
Right, so those special and emergency sessions are all in addition to the regular session that would have to occur at least once a month.
Right. In addition to that, the Legislative Council, the President, the President on Article 6 may schedule an emergency session of the Legislative Council without written notice, right? Which is distinct, right? All of these other ones require notice posted in advance. An emergency session can be called by the president without written notice to consider urgent matters, services, protection of the health, welfare, and safety of the citizens and communities of the White Earth Nation. However, in Article 7, the Legislative Council shall conduct no other business than the specific stated purpose in that emergency session. Right? In Article 8, the Legislative Council shall also have the authority to meet in closed executive sessions, right, where members cannot attend. They're excluded.
Right, they're kept out.
With the president to discuss matters of litigation, proposed and discrete negotiations, and other concerns of confidentiality. However, in Article 9, the Legislative Council shall not decide actions on matters of litigation or confidentiality in closed executive sessions, except when the outcome of the session has been fully reported in subsequent public sessions of the Legislative Council. The results of executive sessions shall be decided by a vote at a public meeting. So they can, the Legislative Council, organize a closed session, right? A closed executive session. But the actual decisions made, or oh no, the actual conversation or discussion made has to be fully reported in the subsequent public session, and the actual decision or vote on that issue has to be made at a public meeting.
So there's no voting in the closed meeting. They can have negotiations, maybe it's contract negotiations for services or for building or something of that nature.
Right.
They can discuss that, but then that must be reported, and then the vote has to be in public. So again, trying to provide as much information for citizens and trying to provide some measures of maybe checks in some way so that business and other decisions can't be made in secret, that citizens have to have access.
So you have four kind of sessions, right? A regular session, a special session, an emergency session, and a closed session. And each of them are laid out here. Okay. So on page 29, you look at Article 10, which is Chapter 17. Legislative Council motions, votes, resolutions, and decisions shall be noted and preserved in the official minutes. So these go through the way that all of these discussions and decisions are put on the record, and that record is made available to the public. Article 11, Legislative Council actions, decisions, and enactments shall be available for inspection by citizens during normal business hours. Article 12, Legislative Council shall date and number each and every resolution and cite the appropriate authority of the Constitution. Article 13, Legislative Council shall prepare a certificate for each resolution, and that confirms the presence of a quorum, indicates the number of members voting for and against each of those pieces of legislation. And then Article 14 establishes the quorum at 51% of the elected members. Okay, so that is the legislative. Any other comment on the Legislative Council? No? Okay.
I think that especially the last part is quite procedural, so hopefully it's relatively straightforward. It lays out, again, the framework. There will ultimately have to be decided the rules and procedures of exactly how the meetings take place, but this lays out some principles and some framework.
So we'll take a final break here, and then when we reconvene, we'll cover the third branch of government, the judicial branch.